International news now.
Okay, so we want to begin with a review of recent events and developments since our last INN at UT about 2 weeks ago. And we're going to start with a discussion here, a short one really, of Israel's ground invasion that began around October 27th. And I say it started around October 27th because it's really hard to pin down the exact start of the ground invasion. It was shrouded in secrecy. The Israeli military didn't want to get any sort of information out because they knew that it would help Hamas and its adversary to prepare them for their actions. They also wanted to control the narrative, I think, as well, and not have a lot of other outside forces try to change their plans. And so not only did they not talk about when and how the invasion was going to take place, but they also took out communications in Gaza during the invasion. And so there was a lot of confusion and lack of information, because what Israel did when it started to move troops into Gaza was that it blocked all cell phone and other forms of communication, so that there wasn't a lot of information going in, and more importantly for Israel, not a lot of information going out. And so that was, of course, quite frightening for anybody who had family in Gaza at the time, but it was part of their overall strategy to kind of control how things went. And so the invasion started over that weekend. No real news came out of it, and how it was being conducted, and what the extent of it was, really until about the Monday after that weekend. There started the communication started to come back in Gaza after some pressure from the United States to lift that action, and then the international community and Israelis and Palestinians and everybody else tried to kind of cobble together what this invasion was looking like. And just to say a few things, at the same time that they moved in troops, Israel also substantially increased airstrikes in preparation and to take out and destroy certain Hamas targets, to make it easier for Israeli ground troops to start to target and destroy its Hamas fighters in Gaza, and including their underground tunnels and other assets. And these airstrikes, this really sharp increase in airstrikes was the action that started to substantially increase the civilian casualties in Gaza. And so as a result of these airstrikes that Israel says didn't target civilian communities, but rather targeted Hamas targets, there were civilian communities right there as well, and so it was difficult to differentiate. And we're going to talk more about that. But
yes.
No, but
well, so in terms of the targeting challenges, one of the things that's going on is Hamas has embedded its leadership infrastructure in tunnels, oftentimes underneath hospitals.
Yeah.
Intentionally embedding within the civilian infrastructure to try and deter attacks against the civilian infrastructure that then increase civilian casualties. And this is one of the challenges associated with fighting this war.
Yeah, the clip you're going to see of the interview with Benjamin Netanyahu, he says just that. And that is the challenge here for Israel. Nevertheless, the casualties have increased and now have reached over 10,000 killed in Gaza. And because of that, there's been a lot more calls for humanitarian ceasefires, a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza because of the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding there.
And we should add, too, in terms of the broader nature of the humanitarian crisis, it's not just about the loss of life, it's about the complete halting of emergency aid, food, and water, Hospitals basically can't function. They don't have drugs.
Right.
They don't have anesthetics. And so this isn't, obviously this is a significant and huge loss of life, a tragic loss of life, but there's a deeper humanitarian catastrophe
Right.
for the people that are left.
Yeah, it's terrible conditions there. And that's partly what contributes to this loss of life. But there was even just a news story today that I heard that a lot of the deaths so far have been because of the military actions, but in the short-term future, there's going to be a crisis of just disease that will claim a lot more casualties too, because of the lack of medicine, food, water, power. That is also restricted by Israel as part of their military strategy, because they're afraid that those provisions will go to Hamas.
And this is complicated by the destruction of homes and apartments and the like, right?
Right,
I
because
mean,
they're also displaced.
yes.
Yes, and so this is, it's a...
Okay, so let's take a step back and discuss Israeli military strategy a bit. We're going to start with a short video clip from the PBS NewsHour, so let's go ahead and run that clip.
Israeli airstrikes continued today, including on a building inside the Al-Shifa hospital compound. Among the victims, a desperate man trying to save a child. Israel accuses Hamas of hiding in hospitals and released new footage today of tunnels next to and underneath Gaza hospitals in the north. But Israel is increasingly focused on its ground operation, approaching closer to Gaza City. Soldiers in northern Gaza also captured what used to be a scouts' headquarters for kids, where they said Hamas launched rockets. Israeli forces are trying to encircle Gaza City from 3 axes: the northeast into Beit Hanun, the northwest along the Mediterranean Sea, and across central Gaza, cutting the strip in two.
The forces on the ground are advancing according to the operational plan, moving forward, increasing the pressure deep in Gaza City.
Okay, so I want to emphasize a few things here. First, let's briefly outline the parameters of the stated goal for the Israeli military, which is the elimination of Hamas. This is an ambitious task for a variety of reasons. First, Hamas is a large organization in Gaza. According to estimates, there are as many as 30,000 Hamas fighters and another 30,000 members of Hamas in non-combatant roles. Remember that Hamas has been the sole governing entity in Gaza since they drove out Fatah in a civil war in 2007. So Hamas members have been serving in civilian positions in schools, hospitals, and government ministries. Identifying all or most of them will be a big project, and a big project, perhaps impossible project, and will leave a power vacuum in Gaza after military hostilities cease. Second, Hamas members, including fighters trying to kill Israeli soldiers, blend in with the population and so are difficult to identify. And finally, the network of tunnels underneath Gaza gives the entity a defensive position, Hamas, additional advantages against the one with an offensive approach to conquer territory, the Israeli military.
So it's just easier to play defense, to fight in a defensive status than offense.
Yes, and it's much more difficult to take out these tunnels through airstrikes. Airstrikes, particularly when the entrances to the tunnels are embedded in civilian infrastructure.
And if you throw in the idea that there's hostages potentially in these tunnels too, that Israeli forces don't want to harm, you've got a very scary and complicated situation for the soldiers.
Yeah. So how is Israel planning to eliminate Hamas? Israel has taken 2 steps: encircling Gaza City and dividing northern from southern Gaza. And this tells us something about the military strategy. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, is isolating Gaza City and the northern region of Gaza to separate Hamas from the rest of the population so that the military can wage, the Israeli military can wage a sustained campaign against Hamas's military assets. Military commentators have argued that this approach is intended to limit civilian casualties and adapt to the complexities associated with a full-scale ground incursion against a well-entrenched Hamas defense. Now, one analyst described the expected Israeli strategy to be a slow and steady pressure campaign that involves several steps to wear down Hamas. The steps involve raids, intelligence gathering, and clearing small pockets of fighters and then holding those small pockets of territory. From these pockets, Israeli troops plan to strike at Hamas's leaders and then withdraw back to the cleared areas. Now, if this military strategy succeeds as planned, this process will allow a slow building out of pockets in Gaza that are removed from the control of Hamas. It will likely take time, perhaps months, many months. However, there's a question about whether Israel can sustain this type of military campaign for such a long period of time in the face of international pressure, because one of the costs of this military campaign is a growing number of civilian casualties. And now we see the increase in civilian casualties and the growth of pressure on Israel to have pauses or to think about alternatives. So just yesterday, an American military official made headlines by stating, this was in the New York Times, right?
Yeah.
By stating that Israel had a limited time to carry out its military operations, a closing window, so to speak. For members of the Biden administration, the logic of this time constraint is as follows. The longer the Israeli military campaign continues, the greater chance that the conflict will spark a wider war. And perhaps more importantly, Israel's forceful military response in Gaza has fueled sympathy around the world for the Palestinian cause and increased international pressure for a ceasefire.
And that sympathy is just going to grow the longer that Israel is in Gaza fighting this war. And so there's this dilemma here because they're going slow in part to protect their own troops so they don't have a lot of military casualties. They're trying to isolate Hamas and separate him from the civilian population so that there's fewer civilian casualties, although there's a bunch of airstrikes and there's the siege that harms the civilians, right? And this go slow approach would have over, time, fewer casualties, but now if they have a short time window, they might do, less deliberate, slow approach to inflict as much pain on Hamas as possible before they're kind of forced to get out. And that's kind of the debate that's happening now, it seems, is maybe they have to go faster. Faster is going to be
faster
worse.
will have more humanitarian consequences
problems.
and they're already really bad, and they would get worse if they have to speed
and so
up.
that's something. Okay. So now let's move on to an update on recent U.S. actions since Israel launched its ground assault. And so we're going to start with a clip from ABC News on the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken's trip to the Middle East. So go ahead and run that clip now.
Karen, how is the Biden administration responding to this pressure, one, and also trying to reassure U.S. allies in the Middle East that this conflict won't spill over?
Yeah, by sending Secretary of State Antony Blinken on what was quite a whirlwind trip of diplomacy over the weekend, Diane. Their big focus, of course, is trying to contain this war, preventing new fronts from breaking out. You saw Secretary of State Blinken going to the West Bank, trying to urge calm there, restore calm after some recent violence. But of course, a big focus also continues to be on that push for temporary humanitarian pauses. The White House wants to see those pauses by Israel in order to get more aid into Gaza, to try to move more people to safety there and get people out, including Americans, and also secure the release of hostages. This, of course, comes as the administration continues to put pressure on Israel to try to minimize civilian casualties. We heard the Secretary of State address that today. Here's what he said.
Hey, when it comes to humanitarian pauses, we're engaged with the Israelis on the particular practicalities of that. One critical aspect, though, is seeing progress on hostages. That's something we're intensely focused on, but we also believe that a pause could help advance that proposition as well.
And Diane, President Biden said last week that he was able to successfully get the Israeli Prime Minister to agree to a temporary pause in their activities in order to secure the release of 2 American hostages, those 2 women from Illinois. But this is something that the White House wants to see more of. They've kind of said they want to see them strung together in order to have a couple successions of these temporary pauses to achieve those goals. Diane?
Secretary Blinken, Karen, also made a surprise visit to Iraq on this trip. Why did he go there, and how is he trying to ensure the safety of U.S. troops stationed there?
Yeah, that's a big priority and a big concern right now for the administration. And a part of Secretary Blinken's message was meant to go toward Iran, to say, do not try to take advantage of this situation and destabilize things in the region. This comes, of course, after those Iranian-backed militias have targeted U.S. troops in Iran. There have been multiple incidents of this, including one that required and prompted a response from the United States. So Blinken there was meeting with the Iraqi prime minister. They both condemned those recent incidents and then focusing on what else could be done. But also, as I say, the big message, though, for Iran is cut this out and try to do not make this any more destabilizing than it is right now.
All right. I briefly want to highlight several of the steps that the Biden administration has taken during this trip by Blinken. These actions show a continuation of the U.S. strategy to both support Israel's right to defend itself, while at the same time trying to limit Israel's military actions to reduce the number of casualties and ease the humanitarian crisis in Hamas. It's also part of a broader strategy to make sure that the conflict doesn't expand to other places in the region. Now, it's important to note that Blinken met with both Israeli officials and officials in neighboring Arab states allied with the United States. The United States is trying to maintain ties with states in the region that have that view this conflict very differently, and so this is a pretty difficult exercise to execute. And so, Arab states in the region are facing increasing pressures from their own citizens in the form of pro-Palestinian protests in the streets to do something about the high number of casualties resulting from Israel's ground invasion of Gaza. And so Blinken heard from these allies that they are facing the potential threat of domestic instability within their own countries as a product of the war between Israel and Hamas. And consequently then, the United States is hearing from its regional allies in the Middle East that the U.S. must do something to restrain Israel's military action in Gaza, or there could be this widespread unrest that could potentially produce instability outside of Israel. And so that's part of this sort of jigsaw puzzle that the United States is trying to manage here in the whole region. Now, one way that the U.S. is trying to achieve this balancing act between supporting its ally Israel and the right to defend itself, as well as its Arab allies in the region, is to call for temporary humanitarian pauses to the fighting in Gaza. And the U.S. has been careful to say that it is not calling for a ceasefire. It agrees, the United States agrees currently with Israel that a general ceasefire would leave Hamas intact in Gaza and then would be capable to attack Israel again sometime in the future. So it's not calling for a general ceasefire, but the call for humanitarian pauses in fighting by the United States is to allow the safe delivery of aid into Gaza and to help negotiate the release of hostages and other humanitarian measures. So arguably, it's also a device to ease some of the pressure that is mounting on actors around the region because of the increased casualties in the intense conflict from in Gaza. And so that's, the United States is trying to help these other allies in neighboring states and by a small break in the fighting to send a signal that there are some constraints on Israel's military actions. And so U.S. pressure has brought some results. Israel agreed just beginning yesterday to have daily 4-hour pauses in the fighting in certain areas of Gaza to allow citizens to leave combat areas. And this is a kind of a reversal, as you'll see in the next section, that Prime Minister Netanyahu sort of dismissed the idea of humanitarian pauses in his interview on ABC News, but the Israeli government has sort of gone back a little bit on that. And so finally, Blinken's trip was also meant to reiterate the signal to Iran that the United States is fully engaged in the region and committed to using its military power and its military assets, which it's also moved into the region in the form of battleships and the like, to keep war in Gaza from spreading across the region. And so Blinken visited the West Bank, for example, to try to calm tensions there after incidents of violence by Israeli settlers against Palestinians threatened to open a second conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, which would potentially really blow up the conflict and bring in all sorts of different actors. But Blinken also visited Iraq in response to a surge in attacks by Iranian-allied militias there and in Syria. And the U.S. is concerned that Iran and the militia groups that it supports may take advantage of this situation in Gaza to further destabilize the whole Middle East. And so Iranian-backed militias launched, according to news reports, at least 32 rocket and other kinds of attacks on U.S. facilities in Iraq and Syria. And the U.S. has already responded at least once with a retaliatory strike. So this is a potential another place where this conflict could really spill over in the region.
So now we're going to shift our focus to broader issues of the political goals of the three major actors in this conflict: Israel, Hamas, and the United States, and how they're evolving. You might remember that we engaged in the same exercise in our first news segment on this war. The interests of these actors, like we said, have evolved and crystallized enough to warrant another look. And so we're going to tackle Israel's political goals first. And we're going to start the discussion by playing a couple of clips in succession from an interview of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on ABC News. So let's go ahead and roll that clip.
I know the Biden administration has also said now is not the time for a ceasefire. What they're proposing is a humanitarian pause. There will be no pause?
Well, there will be no ceasefire, general ceasefire in Gaza without the release of our hostages. As far as tactical little pauses, an hour here, an hour there, we've had them before. I suppose we'll check the circumstances in order to enable goods, humanitarian goods to come in, or our hostages, individual hostages to leave. But I don't think there's going to be a general ceasefire. It's not that I don't think. I think it will hamper the war effort. It'll hamper our effort to get our hostages out, because the only thing that works on these criminals in Hamas is the military pressure that we're exerting.
If Hamas agrees to release the hostages, then there would be a pause.
Well, there'd be a ceasefire for that purpose. And we're waiting for that to happen. It hasn't happened so far.
Do you know where the hostages are? Do you know where the Americans are?
We have some intelligence. I'm not sure it's wise to share it here with Hamas.
I know you said you're doing everything you can to minimize civilian casualties. Obviously, the world saw the horror in Israel, the 1,400 brutally killed in that terror attack. We were on the ground for several days, as you know. But the world has now also seen the toll in Gaza. The health ministry run by Hamas now says 10,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed, 4,000 of them children. I'm not asking about Hamas here. I'm asking about the 10,000 civilians killed. Are you concerned about the number of civilians that we've seen lost, caught in the middle of this conflict?
I think every civilian loss is a tragedy. Every civilian life lost is a tragedy. We're fighting an enemy that is particularly brutal. They're using their civilians as human shields. And while we're asking the Palestinian civilian population to leave the war zone, they're preventing them at gunpoint. They're using them as human shields.
President Biden has said that it would be a mistake for Israel to occupy Gaza. Who should govern Gaza when this is over?
Those who don't want to continue the way of Hamas. It certainly is not. I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility, because we've seen what happens when we don't have it. When we don't have that security responsibility, what we have is the eruption of Hamas terror on a scale that we couldn't imagine.
So let's talk a little bit about this clip. First, the primary goal for Israel remains the same and has not changed since launching the ground invasion. Israel's aim is to destroy Hamas and remove it from power in Gaza. The Israeli government and the Israeli people have decided that they cannot tolerate the existence of Hamas anymore on their borders. As we explained in the last news segment, the Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7th has fundamentally changed how Israel approaches Hamas. It's decided that Hamas is an existential threat to Israel and its survival. As long as Hamas exists in Gaza, the citizens of Israel will be vulnerable to more terrorist attacks. Thus, in order to protect its citizens, the Israeli government now believes that it must eliminate Hamas. All other considerations are secondary to this objective. Most importantly, the Israeli government is not clear on what comes after the war against Hamas. We're going to talk further about this problem of the endgame in this conflict a little bit later. So all of Israel's other actions thus far in its war in Gaza follow from this primary objective to destroy Hamas. First, as Netanyahu makes clear in this interview clip, Israel mostly resists calls for humanitarian pauses to the fighting in Gaza. From Israel's perspective, pauses in the fighting are dangerous for Israeli troops and detrimental to the mission in Gaza because they provide opportunities for Hamas to regroup, rearm, or relocate forces to escape Israel's attacks. Netanyahu concedes that Israel has and will continue to provide very short pauses within limited locations and for specific purposes, such as allowing in humanitarian aid, allowing civilians to leave combat zones, or allowing the release of prisoners. However, a general ceasefire or longer pauses will be resisted because they provide too many advantages to Hamas. Netanyahu also defends Israeli tactics despite high civilian casualties. From Israel's perspective, the high level of civilian deaths in Gaza are a consequence of the way that Hamas has embedded itself in Gaza and how Hamas is fighting this war in Gaza. As you heard in the clip, Netanyahu argues that Hamas has intentionally built its tunnels under civilian infrastructure like hospitals and schools so that Israel's attacks on Hamas will cause high civilian casualties, and they are using Palestinian civilians, Hamas is using Palestinian civilians as human shields. Finally, this interview made headlines because Netanyahu announced that Israel would need to have overall security responsibility in Gaza for an indefinite period. This message ran counter to previous statements from Israeli government officials that the country did not want to occupy Gaza after the war. It generated a lot of political controversy and backlash, not only in Israel, but in the broader world, because the expectation has been that Israel could not take responsibility for governing Gaza in the long run, because it is completely unsustainable. As a result, this remark sparked an immediate backlash. I already said that, within Israel and outside. Israeli officials later clarified that Israel did not intend to occupy Gaza. And other commentators have said that the government has walked back Netanyahu's comment in the last couple of days. Nevertheless, one might look at Netanyahu's comment as an acknowledgement of an uncomfortable reality in Gaza, which is that there may not be another entity willing and able to take over basic governing functions in Gaza, except for Israel after the war is over, at least for the short term. Did you talk about Blinken's statement about empowering Palestinian Authority in Gaza?
Yeah, we're going to talk about
that later. All right, well,
Hold your horses.
Sorry.
Okay, so let's move on then and revisit the political goals of Hamas. And as you may remember, we argued in the previous news segment that the timing of the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel could have been precipitated by changing relations between Israel and some of its neighbors, particularly the prospect of a normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, these developments on this wider scale threatened, arguably, to diminish the status and relevance of Hamas, and thus commentators have argued that Hamas used the attack on October 7th as a spoiling strategy to disrupt negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. At least in part, that was the reason. And so now that October 7th attack has produced a devastating retaliation from Israel that is aimed at destroying completely Hamas, it's useful to revisit the political goals of Hamas to decide if they remain the same. And so we're going to start this discussion with an audio clip from the Ezra Klein Show, which is a podcast from the New York Times. This is a clip from an interview with a Palestinian scholar and activist. And in it, he describes the strategic logic behind the Hamas attack and the goals that it tried to accomplish by this attack and what its further goals might be. And so let's run that clip now.
How much do you think it understood that it was going to bring down a hellacious war?
To be honest, it's really hard to say. And I've been talking with a lot of people of exactly what Hamas thought it was going to get out of this. And there are two elements to this operation as well. You know, there's the one side of it is the military nature of it, of like breaking out of the fence, of attacking military targets. Like this was kind of like the first phase of what happened on October 7th in the morning hours of that. And this is what Palestinians are really have been mostly kind of looking to, as just like that the group had the capacity to actually break out of this cage and that they could actually completely humiliate the Israeli military, that it wasn't as invincible as everyone was making it out to be, and that there was a way to shatter out of it. But then that second side of that, of course, are these horrific massacres that happened in the southern communities. I mean, I can't speak to how much they were directed. I can't speak to how much, was sort of like, not just in the question of like a fog of war, but also the rage of war that these militants also launched some of the massacres that they did like that. We'll only get to know this, in the coming weeks, months, and years, as we investigate this more. But it's just unclear entirely what it was. Or were they just trying to play a certain card just to say, like, just change something? Like, just change anything out of the equilibrium? Did they have a more concerted plan in coordination with groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, hoping that would serve enough deterrence? Like, there's no way Hamas did this thinking that the Israelis were not going to respond so viciously. And we're not sure how much they thought they could get away with in the military assault in the first place. And so there's just so much uncertainty, and we're still in that fog as we speak. So I really can't speak to it. And even now we're hearing different conflicting things sometimes from members of the Hamas movement, from the political bureau, from the armed wing, from the people in Gaza versus people outside. So it's been very messy to see all this. But in many respects, putting aside all these questions, there's no doubt that I think Hamas, for the better and the worse, has really thrown everyone in the region back onto the Palestinian question. At a time where it was really being marginalized, Hamas has very violently forced all the Arab states to rethink their alliances with Israel and to realize that the Palestinians still have political cards to play, even when done in such brutal fashion. And it's been very complex to kind of navigate their full calculations about this. But I think even just the very idea to show the Israelis that you can no longer go on like this, I think for Hamas was also like an important message to send.
Okay, let me make a few points here. The reason I pulled this clip out was to kind of address this idea of what the strategy of Hamas was and whether they kind of made a miscalculation that they thought maybe they could get away with such a vicious and terrorist attack without a huge Israeli counterattack. But what this clip really shows is that Hamas probably had very concrete strategic goals here, that they were prepared to launch an attack knowing that an Israeli retaliation would be aimed at eliminating them in response, because they had two concrete goals. One was military and one was political. And the military goal was, as described in this clip, to show the relative strength of Hamas and the relative vulnerability of the Israeli state. And because of the way that the Palestinian issue was sort of beginning to get sidelined by the Israeli government, but also by Arab states that, at least rhetorically, were in support of Palestinians, but then, and their cause for greater autonomy and independence, were willing to negotiate with Israel without demanding some sort of concession on the Palestinian issue. What Hamas first tried to signal to its domestic supporters, but also to a broader audience, was that it still could break out of its confines. It could launch a devastating attack against Israel. So it tried to demonstrate that it could kind of break out of what was a pretty constraining environment and threaten the Israeli state to kind of demonstrate that it still had some assets in a role to play here.
And can I add a little bit of this too, in terms of this signal of demonstrating military strength, understand that the impact that this has had on Israeli society as well. Right. This was a tremendous failure on the part of the Israeli government. Right. And to this extent, in terms of a military strategy to demonstrate that Hamas still had military capabilities relative to Israel, the Israeli government failed to protect its civilian population in the south in a horrific way. And this will lead to a reckoning in Israeli politics. There's already the public opinion polls that have come out that suggest that Likud and Netanyahu will be in real trouble after this is over. But this is about the failure of the Israeli state to protect its population.
And that's an aim for Hamas, right?
Yes.
I mean, what Hamas really wanted to show is that the Israeli state wasn't invulnerable, wasn't sort of permanently protected against and could do whatever it wanted, including kind of just keep a status quo that was, from Hamas's perspective, suboptimal for the Palestinians in Gaza and simply just go on with life as normal. They wanted to break out of that status quo. And, you know, all terrorist groups, when they are trying to compete with a stronger adversary. I mean, the Israeli military is much stronger than Hamas's military resources, is that they have to signal these sorts of high-profile attacks just to make sure that their followers still think that they've got it. They can you know, cause harm to their adversary. And their intent is to weaken Israel, and they did. They weakened the Israeli government here.
And the other thing that we should keep in mind here, and that's going to come in the reckoning of all of this, is there's also an argument that Hamas seized on a tactical opportunity because the Israeli government had repositioned military assets to the West Bank. And they took for granted security on the southern front relative to Hamas. They trusted in the construction of the wall and the technology that was governing the wall, which was quickly taken out in the initial stages of the attack. It was a tremendous failure of defensive capabilities. And so that's part of this too, that there was a short-term tactical objective or tactical opportunity that stemmed from the repositioning of Israeli assets to West Bank and away from the south.
And so related to this was the political goal. And the political goal here was this attempt to force a dramatic change in the status quo by thrusting the Palestinian question back onto the agenda. What had happened in Israeli domestic politics, but also in the broader international politics of the region, was that a change, a gradual evolution that took the Palestinian question sort of off the agenda. It made it a secondary or even tertiary consideration to other interests, not just in Israel, who thought that they could sort of, they thought they had Gaza handled in a way, but also in these neighboring states who thought that, you know, they could normalize relations with Israel and just also ignore the Palestinian cause. And so that political goal was to say, that's not possible. We can, through violence, force you to pay attention and do something about the Palestinian question. And so this was a violent, horrendous act, but it had a political goal. You can't just ignore the Palestinian question. That was their political goal. And in a lot of ways, they accomplished these goals. They showed vulnerability of Israel, they showed some military strength, and they did thrust the Palestinian question back on the agenda. Now, the bigger question for Hamas, for this part of the conflict, is what now? What does Hamas do after such an attack? Well, I'd say first they're going to try to just survive. right? They're going to try to weather the counterattack so that and manage it in a way that they'll probably count on suffering a lot of heavy losses, but they just don't want to be completely wiped out. And so, because if they can survive, they can come back in to fight another day. But it also shows that their relevance and their perpetual strategy has to be sustained armed conflict with Israel. I think that there's not a world where Hamas becomes a political actor that simply governs Palestinians in either Gaza or West Bank or somewhere and isn't a military threat to Israel. Its whole identity is wrapped up into this.
Yeah, and I mean, in the context of talking about these goals, we need to remember Hamas is an extremist terrorist organization whose overarching political goal is the destruction of the Israeli state.
Exactly.
And by demonstrating
by
demonstrating these military capacities, this has reoriented the Israeli government's position that we can no longer live with Hamas on our borders given these goals, because now they have more capabilities than we thought they did.
Right.
And so we can no longer tolerate that. So let's revisit U.S. goals here. And as we've discussed, the United States has been balancing goals of supporting Israel and its right to defend itself with other goals, such as avoiding a wider regional war and constraining Israeli military action to limit the number of civilian casualties in Gaza. In this discussion, we're going to concentrate on the recent announcement from Secretary of State Blinken that the U.S. supports a post-war settlement that joins Gaza and the West Bank together under self-government decided by Palestinians. This runs counter to Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement that Israel would have a prominent role over security in Gaza after the war. So we're going to start with a clip from the PBS NewsHour, and so go ahead and run that clip.
In Tokyo, group of 7 diplomats weighed in on the war, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
The G7 ministers reaffirmed our staunch support for Israel's right and obligation to defend itself.
They issued a unified statement after 2 days of intense talks. It backs Israel's retaliation against Hamas while calling for urgent action to help civilians in Gaza.
We all agreed that humanitarian pauses would advance key objectives: to protect Palestinian civilians, to increase the sustained flow of humanitarian assistance, to allow our citizens and foreign nationals to exit, and to facilitate the release of hostages.
And on Gaza after the war, Secretary Blinken made clear there's no room for Hamas.
Gaza cannot be continue to be run by Hamas. It's also clear that Israel cannot occupy Gaza.
He did warn of a, quote, transition period afterward, but reaffirmed that Palestinians ultimately need to govern the enclave.
So a few points here. First, it's clear that Blinken's statement was a reaction to Netanyahu's comments that Israel would need to take a prominent security responsibility in Gaza after the war. The Biden administration likely felt compelled to quickly stake out a position that on its preferred endgame for the war, no Israeli occupation and Palestinian self-government of Gaza and the West Bank, to signal that the United States did not support any type of settlement that left Israel in charge of Gaza.
But also not Hamas in charge of Gaza as well.
Yeah.
So
the U.S. needed to signal this message to its Arab allies in the region, and the Biden administration needed to signal this to an American and international audience that is increasingly sympathetic to the humanitarian crisis for Palestinians in Gaza. Of course, the biggest problem with the U.S. position is that the Biden administration has offered no plan for how to reach its preferred outcome for a post-war settlement in Gaza and the West Bank. Uniting the West Bank and Gaza under the Palestinian Authority is a difficult proposition. The Palestinian Authority currently governs only the West Bank, and it's quite unpopular among Palestinians due to widespread corruption and the lack of its governing capacity. Moreover, Mahmoud Abbas originally stated that the Palestinian Authority would never move in to govern Gaza on the backs of Israeli tanks. And the claim here is that the Palestinian Authority couldn't have any legitimacy if it rested on Israeli military force. So Blinken's announcement since Blinken's announcement, the Palestinian Authority has told the Biden administration that it is open to a governance role in post-Hamas Gaza if the United States commits to a full-fledged two-state solution to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This would mean a long process of negotiation between the two sides, likely brokered by the United States. And one thing to keep in mind about all this and the challenges of a post-Hamas Gaza is remember that there are still significant divisions within Palestinians between groups that support Hamas, largely based in Gaza, and groups that support the Palestinian Authority, largely based in the West Bank. And so part of the peace process in a two-state solution means these two sides among Palestinians finding some common ground.
And then, of course, there's divisions in Israeli society as well. So this would be a huge and long-lasting project to have a united West Bank and Gaza under Palestinian self-government.
Yeah.
And it, so okay, let's sort of wrap things up today with a discussion of the potential end game for this conflict. And there is no silver bullet here. I mean, this is the most difficult part of this tragic war, trying to figure out what happens in Gaza and in Israel and for the Palestinians in the West Bank as well after the war between Israel and Hamas ends. And so we're going to start with, on this last segment here, with an audio clip from National Public Radio that outlines some of the dilemmas facing all the actors in a post-war Gaza. And so let's go ahead and run that clip now.
So who might take on such a monumental task? Orna Mizrahi, a former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor, concedes there's no clear candidate.
If you want to replace Hamas, who is going to come afterwards? What is going to be in the day after? This is the big question.
The Palestinian Authority nominally leads the Palestinians in the West Bank. It used to run Gaza as well. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that over time, a revitalized Palestinian Authority could return to Gaza. But that seems unrealistic at the moment, says Mizrahi.
I'm not sure that the Palestinian Authority will want to come in after Israel.
In fact, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, who turns 88 next week, reportedly told the U.S. last month, "I will not return to Gaza on top of an Israeli tank." Hamas took charge in Gaza by winning Palestinian elections in 2006. The following year, Hamas militants drove the Palestinian Authority out in a bloody battle. Since then, Israel and Hamas have fought repeatedly, but Israel never sought to drive out the militant group. This time, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the goal is to completely destroy Hamas.
Anything less than that will be viewed as a failure by the public.
Chuck Freilich is a former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor.
Whether you think it's the right thing to do or not, I mean, the government may have just roped themselves into doing that.
Privately, Israeli officials say they'd like to bring in the international community to help run a future Gaza. But prospects aren't good. Neighboring Egypt isn't interested. It's long sought to keep Gaza's chaos from spilling over its border. Wealthy Arab states like Qatar cut large checks to Gaza, but show no interest in getting directly involved. The United Nations provides basic services there, like food, health care, and schooling, but is not equipped to govern. In addition, Freilich says, Hamas would not accept rule by outsiders.
How do you keep them in power? Because it's clear that the remnants of Hamas or whoever will be doing everything to kill the guy who's in power.
All right, so in thinking through the end game and how the Israeli government and other actors are going to try to figure out what to do with the Gaza Strip and other issues after the war with Hamas, let me just first start with some of the problems that are related to the original goal of destroying Hamas. There's two principal problems that's going to complicate politics in post-war Gaza that stem directly from the ambitious goal of Israel trying to destroy Hamas, right? And that I'm going to just center around two of them. First, the force needed to destroy Hamas and keep it destroyed, right? So there would be some sort of post-conflict counterterrorism strategy that would need to continue to use force to stamp out terrorist, attacks of anybody who's trying to rule post-war Gaza. That force is likely to produce future extremism in that region. And so you could destroy Hamas, the structure and the organization, but some commentators say, frame it this way: you can't really destroy the idea of Hamas, the idea that there's going to be some sentiment among a portion of that population because of their experience, especially after this war, that want to continue to fight and use violence to destroy Israel. And so even if you do succeed in dismantling and destroying Hamas, you might still have a Gaza that is an environment that will be ripe for future extremism. And the second thing that we're going to talk about in a bit more detail here when we talk about who governs post-war Gaza is that this Israeli invasion almost instantly undermined the legitimacy of the successor entity that's going to move into Gaza, because Israel and its invasion destroyed the governing authority, and any group, whether it's the Palestinian Authority or some other Palestinian entity, or an international sort of entity of a coalition of Arab states, or some other international force to try to maintain political order, they will face attacks and resistance from the citizens in Gaza, because they will be tied to that Israeli invasion. As the quote from Mahmoud Abbas, we're not going to enter into Gaza on the backs of Israeli tanks. So those are the problems associated just by the very nature of the military invasion by Israel.
So now the question is, right, who governs? And, and we have to think about long-term legitimacy here. It's going to be incredibly challenging for in the United States, and Blinken says we would support the Palestinian Authority, but by the U.S. saying that it would support the Palestinian Authority simultaneously creates a legitimacy crisis for the Palestinian Authority.
They seem to be puppets of
the United States. Are they puppets of Israel, or are they puppets of the United States?
I mean, it's...
And so this is one of the long-term challenges, is that for a peace to emerge, there has to be some set of internal changes among Palestinians, internal political changes, in some sense, a movement to the political center that's willing to limit the influence of extremists and terrorists within Hamas or within the governance structure of the Palestinian Authority. But that, now we're talking about a significant domestic political change, and that, if it's installed from the outside, whoever that wins or that emerges from this could be delegitimized through support from external powers.
And perhaps that's what that signal from Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority in demanding some sort of two-state solution and concessions as a condition for governing in governing in Gaza is trying to accomplish, is some sort of basis of legitimacy where they could say, well, look what we got in exchange for moving into a governing position in Gaza. And I think there's going to have to be some sort of, settlement that includes that.
There's this possibility of a coalition of Arab states, but then the question is, what's the political will for these states to stay for the long haul? Right? I think you can come up with the economic resources to rebuild some infrastructure, particularly from the Saudis.
Yeah.
But then the question is...
Yeah, the rebuilding is a big part of this. You're going to have to really pour in a lot of resources there.
But then can all of the coalition that comes in, can they maintain the coalition and maintain the will, which is an open-ended question, right? And if they haven't been concerned about this issue for 15 or 20 years, the question is how long will they be able to sustain a commitment to govern in
But
Gaza?
there isn't this attraction to a coalition of Arab states because that would be a bit more acceptable than some other international
They would have-
body, right? They'd
yeah.
have a little more legitimacy.
Yeah.
And there, I mean, what I see, at least in my survey of, is that of what's coming out of Israel is that this is kind of their preferred option, would be some sort of coalition of Arab states that would help and work with Israel to maintain a stable environment. And so that's the hope. It's just that it's really hard to see that even getting pulled off too, because they face the same problems as the Palestinian Authority does. So.
And let me just say, I mean, kind of finish up with kind of how I'm understanding and thinking about this conflict. And I think that to reach some type of sustainable peace is going to require significant domestic political change on both sides. And there have been some signals that Israeli society is moving back to the center and that there'll be electoral changes, but the same thing has to happen within Palestinian society. And unless, and so I suspect that this war is going to continue to churn until it creates pressure that strengthens the center in both sides. I think it's the U.S.'s hope that this is going to create a change in Israeli politics that will undermine far-right elements of Netanyahu's coalition, will undermine Likud and bring back a center-left government that's willing to engage on a two-state solution. But it's incredibly challenging for this to occur. And part of the challenge is here in terms of long-run peace is this thing that we mentioned before, is that as Netanyahu's government has tilted further to the right, the government has supported settlers that are trying to take more territory from Palestinians in the West Bank.
We covered this problem in the last segment. I mean, this is a long-standing problem in the West Bank. The expansion of settlements was always going to make any sort of two-state solution really difficult.
And so I think administration officials aren't going to say this, but they're hoping that at the end of the day that this is going to topple Netanyahu and provide a way to stop settlement expansion, because without stopping settlement expansion, you can't make credible long-term commitments to a two-state solution that allows the Palestinians to govern themselves in the West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that Netanyahu loses the next election isn't a big hurdle. I mean, there seems to be a lot of evidence that he will. Whether the next government takes that bigger step to a sort of different stance that takes a different approach with the Palestinian issue and really starts trying to engage in a two-state solution kind of thing. Now that's the big challenge.
And we should also mention too, because there have been some conversations about this week in American politics. There have been poll numbers that are coming out and that suggest that Biden is going to be in trouble with Trump. This issue is going to have electoral consequences for the United States as well if the war continues for a sustained period of time, right? And we're beginning to see, it's too early to say that the Democratic coalition is split, but we're seeing some significant differences within the Democratic Party over what type and the scope of leverage and pressure that should be put on Israel to stop the war. And the longer this war goes on, the more potential it has to reverberate back into electoral politics in the United States. Again, we're a year away from the 2024 election, but there are lots of White House officials that are thinking about this.
But on the war in Israel, the split is in the Democratic Party. There's not much of a division on the Republican side, and so that's where it's going to play potentially an electoral role. Now the split for the Republicans is on Russia, and there is a growing split there about support for Ukraine, and that is wrapped up in this. That I mean, right now we're heading into a government shutdown, and they can't pass an aid package for Israel because of both of these splits, but primarily because of the split in the Republican Party, where Senate Republicans are supportive of a aid package that both supports Ukraine and Israel, and the Republicans in the House of Representatives don't want to include Ukrainian aid. And that could hold up the whole thing, which is a problem for everybody.
I think that's all we got for this week. If you have, once again, if you have questions about this, if you
want to just talk about this,
want to talk about it, if you want some suggestions on reading, background reading material, who we're watching and listening to that we think is engaging in credible analysis, feel free to reach out. We're happy to provide sources. Otherwise, keep up the good work and keep us posted.